Hello everyone, and welcome back to COSS, our course on commercial open source software startups and how to spin such a startup off from university. We are squarely in the middle of the course. Last time we talked about open source software as an artifact, and today we will talk about open source as a project, as a community undertaking. After that, next time we will talk about commercialization strategies around open source. So today we will discover that there's a second alternative or enhanced definition of open source compared to the one I gave you last time. And it's centered on the collaborative activity of people in communities. And then we will look at how these communities have formed, how they have found organizational structures to sustain the underlying open source projects, and so forth. So, what is an open source project? So far, we talked about software, and we need to understand that the artifact, arguably, is not even necessarily the only, certainly not the only innovation of open source, maybe not even the most important one. When you look to the Open Source Initiative website, you will find that there is, separately from the legal definition, which involved the 10 requirements for an open source software license that turned a software license into an open source license. When you look beyond that, you will find that there's a definition of open source as a development method for software that harnesses the power of peer review and transparency of process and so forth, as you can read here. So while in public debate often this legal definition from the last lecture is dominant, there actually is the second definition which focuses on it's how the people work with each other. It's a development method. It's distributed based on peer review and so forth. So how is that important? Well, it is an innovation that didn't come with GNU Emacs, but that came with the Linux kernel and has been evolved ever since to turn the pure software into a project of people. To be honest, it's actually not really a project because we're talking about the software plus a community of people around it. So in my definition, an open source project is a piece of software provided under an open source license, that's the artifact view, developed by a community of people using certain, to be discussed, principles of open collaboration. It's not a project because there's no defined end date. There's no consulting company behind it. There's no set end date. It's open-ended. That's why it's more like a product, except that most open source software is not a product. It's just a component, perhaps used in products. So that community of people here in a real open source software project, that is a community project, has to be diverse. They collaborate with each other, but they can't, for example, be from the same employer, at least according to the rules of some. We will see how the Apache Software Foundation is an open source software foundation. That's the host to many important open source projects, and they only talk about a community of people if there's diversity of the people involved. So at least 3 different sources, meaning legal entities, so different companies or natural people who contribute. You want diversity among the people in the community to call it a real open source project, and then a community open source project. This form of collaboration, the open source style of collaboration, I call open collaboration, and it's marked by 3 important characteristics. In open source collaboration or open collaboration, everyone can possibly contribute, meaning a soft open source project is open for you to join if you're a reasonable person, and you are not a priori hidden away. Rather, as we will see, open source projects market themselves. They want to be found. So everyone can possibly contribute if your contribution makes any sense. It's also meritocratic, or supposed to be meritocratic, meaning all discussions, all decisions are public, and decisions are made based on the merits of arguments rather than on status. So this can lead to sometimes lengthy, maybe even you might feel obnoxious discussions. But at the end, since it's public, since people can be held to what they said, it's usually a good decision that comes out based on the merits of the argument. And finally, people in the community are organizing their processes themselves. There's no big boss in an open source project, usually, who tells you how to do it. Or if there is one, that's their rules, but they have not been dictated by a company. And then if you don't like the rules, you don't participate. Compare this with traditional work, which is hierarchical, where projects hide each other, so it's not open for contribution, where there's an established status hierarchy by way of the positions of people in the company, where the CTO in the end gets to say how it's done, whether it's good or bad. And finally, companies always want you to be replaceable, hence no self-organized process, rather prescribed process. You have to use Scrum this way or that way, because no company wants to depend specifically on a single person or too many on individual people. And these principles of open collaboration have been stated and reframed in different ways. Before we defined them this way, a traditional way of framing it is calling it the cathedral. That's the open source project, that's the company, and the bazaar, that's the open source project, where the hustle and bustle of a bazaar explains how the work gets done, while inside companies, cathedral makers are at work and it's carefully crafted top-down. I don't believe much of this metaphor here, but it's historically an important piece of writing that people like to cite, so I wanted to show it to you. More interestingly is the Apache Way, which is a collection of statements about how the Apache Software Foundation organizes its development. It's not prescriptive in a way that you would know how to act, but it's a nice capture of what's important. And the Apache Software Foundation has been around for a long time and has given us many important open source software pieces. So you should be respectful of people, you should focus on creating high quality, you should not deny commercialization, etc. And so these are all important aspects of open source according to the Apache Software Foundation. So then, open source software projects have a community, and that community is the group of people and companies engaged with the open source project. Within that community, there are the developers, so not everyone has to be a developer. The developer community are those developing the software, and the user community, often larger, much larger than the developer communities, are those who are using the software. The developers may not even know that you're using the software, which is actually the common case. But if you speak up, for example, because you have a bug to communicate, then you become known as a user of the software. And open source projects define critical roles. That's how people think about open source projects and the communities they form. And these roles or positions really are called user. You're just using the software. Contributor, you made contributions, but you're not part of the core team. And then committer, where you are a core member of the team with commit rights, meaning change rights, write rights to the code base. You advance, arguably, if this is a status hierarchy or a career path, You advance from being a user to being a contributor simply by contributing something. Could be a bug fix, could be a small patch. Whatever you do, if it's a valuable contribution, you're implicitly promoted to being a contributor. However, if you keep contributing, and it's code usually, so if you're a software developer and you're contributing patches and patches, what happens is that the existing core team members have to review all your patches, all your submissions. A contributor cannot change the code base of the project, at least not the official one, because they do not have the change rights, the commit rights. Only committers have the change rights, the commit rights to the main code repositories. So a contributor submits proposed changes, the existing core team members, committers, review those, and if the submitted or suggested changes are good, they will be included in the code base. This way, the contribution becomes real, it gets accepted into the code base. Now, if someone keeps contributing over and over again and the committers learn this is high quality work and they really mostly just wave it through, there's not a lot of review work to be done, nothing to complain about, nothing to change, then a contributor can be made by vote of the committers, the existing committers, can be made one of them. Meaning a contributor can advance from contributor status to committer status. And that is an explicit step. So the committers usually have to vote, do we want that additional person as part of the core team with extended rights? And then if they say, yes, we want that person, we think this is a nice person, we think they can work with us and we won't hate them, then they will make you committer and then they will announce it. So that is an important step to take. This interplay between contributor and committer, which is a status advance for the contributor, but this interplay is also the main quality assurance mechanism of open source. A lot is happening here between a contributor submitting a patch or a proposed contribution and the committers accepting it. First of all, it's the job of the committer to review that proposed contribution and ensure it's good, that it fits the programming standards, that it fits the architecture, that it doesn't introduce anything unwanted, and so forth. So it's this peer review in open source that's the main quality assurance mechanism. Also, this interaction between committers and contributors is a way of how committers grow potential contributors to become committers. Because committers usually actually want help, and the help they want is supposed to be good help, meaning makes life easy for the existing committers. So in this interplay between committer and contributor as they are going over a proposed contribution, in this interplay the committer also teach the contributors to become better developers for the specific project so that eventually a contributor might become a committer. So you see there's a lot going on in this interplay and in this simple two-step, three-step hierarchy. There are more elaborate models of the different roles or positions that people have. I contend it's still users, contributors, and committers. In the displayed model here, so the so-called onion model, which is quite well known, the contributor role has been split up into increasing stages of contribution. Reporting a bug is the lowest rung, or onion, peel. Bug fixes the next one up, peripheral developer, active developer, the next ones, until you become a core member, which means you just switched from being a contributor to a committer, or were switched. You become a core member and a project leader in the end. Another way of looking at it is how the positions in open source actually relate to the classic software engineering activities we know from software development or software engineering processes. In traditional software engineering, there's a clear distinction between the activities and then people who play roles that conform with these activities of being a software tester, a software developer, an engineering manager, and a product manager. These are 4 core roles, and they're usually mapped one-to-one onto people inside companies who develop software. Not open source software, just software. In open source, we really don't see these roles explicitly or mapped in a one-to-one fashion onto people. Rather, we see they are mapped onto exactly the 3 roles or the 3 positions that I just introduced: user, contributor, and committer. Specifically, everyone's a software tester. The users obviously using the software are always testing it, the contributors are naturally testing it, and so are the committers. The development work is only done by contributors and committers. So contributors and committers are the software developers. And then the committers as core team members, they are also picking up the engineering management role or activity and the product management role. And hence the committer post is overloaded with these different activities, which puts them higher into the hierarchy, giving them more authority, more oversight, and much more coordination activity that is due to them. And in that position or post, they become important for defining and enabling the governance of the project. To recapitulate, governance is the set of processes and so forth to manage a social system, which here is the open source software project. And this is basically how an open source software project is run. We will look at that a little bit, not too much. Again, I have a whole full course on open source in general, which is not this one. This one's about commercial open source specifically. The 3 governance models I think that are most widely known are called the BDFL model, the Benevolent Dictator for Life model, and it was popularized by the Linux kernel. So many open source projects exist who have modeled their structure and the interaction of people based on the Linux kernel. It has a hierarchical structure in that people in a tree structure, in a hierarchy, report to a higher up person. That higher up person has multiple people reporting to them, and it all comes together at a single node, the root of the hierarchy. In the Linux kernel, that root node would be occupied by Linus Torvalds, but in other projects it might be other people. There's also the peer group model, which runs development through a core group, the core team of committers and evangelists. In such a core team in which people are equal, they are peers, not everyone has to be a committer. Many times it is developers who are also committers and have commit rights, but there's always also the usual evangelist or other person who's not coding but considered part of the core team. And an example for that is the PostgreSQL relational database management system. And then open source, which is fabulous from a research perspective because everything goes, everything you can possibly dream up as a process exists somewhere. And then there's also what I think others have called it, and I just use the term here, the duocracy, meaning whoever jumps into action will get the right to do it. Those who do rule. And so an example would be the Tiki Wiki CMS groupware software, where if you're reasonable or appear to be reasonable, you will be trusted, you get commit rights right away, and only if your work stinks will it be reverted, rather than quality is assured before your work makes it into the software. So, open source, to provide a little piece from our research here, is solidly commercial these days. By that I mean that companies are paying their developers to work on open source software components. What you see here in this graphic is an old measurement of ours, my research group, and each line is the activity in open source as a whole. We had what we believe was representative sample of open source at the time. And every line is one day of the week, with the dashed ones, dashed 2 lines being the weekend and the others one being the weekdays. And we normalize, put it into a norm day around the world, aligning time zones and so forth. And you can see 3 groups basically of people doing work. So there are those people who do work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And that would be paid developers to who this is a job, and that's it. Then you do see people who work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, but also after dinner and on the weekends. And these would be the enthusiasts who are paid for their work, yes, but they love it so much they also work on it through the weekend. And then you can recognize, I tell you, we found in the data the third category of pure volunteers who are not paid for their work but who do the work on the weekend. So that's why you actually also see a lot of activity on the weekend. And you may wonder now, why do companies pay people? How can there be so much activity? How can it be dominant that work is being done Monday to Friday, 9 to 5? Aren't these companies wasting resources, giving away money, the developer's salary for free because they're contributing to open source? And that raises the question, how has open source become sustainable? And it can only be that somehow commercial, long-running, self-sustained commercial activity has led companies to support open source so that it has achieved that sustainability. And that puts us squarely onto the phenomenon of open source software foundations. So an open source software foundation is a non-profit organization, sometimes called a foundation or a consortium. These are different variations on the same topic, which has the purpose to manage and perform the development of open source software, which is competitively non-differentiating, meaning nobody gains a competitive advantage. Otherwise, you really couldn't make it open source software. And that software is being made available to foundation members and the general public. So, an open source software foundation makes sure that there's a home for open source software available to all by way, and that's regulated by way of the open source license. And because everyone collaborates, nobody has a competitive advantage. So it's infrastructure components that nobody can dominate and gain some competitive differentiation from. Typical members of a developer foundation, typical members of an open source foundations are individual developers, software vendors, so it's the players of the IT industry, also service providers, consulting firms, but also then those from outside the IT industry, the software industry, software users. And as we will see actually in a bit, these different members of a foundation lead to different types of foundations. Here I'm still talking about open source foundations in general. So why do they exist? Why would you need a foundation? Can't you just go on with some place on the web, an open source license, and people who like to collaborate? No, that was not enough at some point of time. You needed that non-profit organization because you wanted to both support and protect the people who were developing the open source software, as well as ensure that if something happens to these people, the software would continue to go on. So you need to protect the people because, say, if something's wrong and it was the software and then the people get sued, then they might lose interest in developing the open source software. But too many companies wanted that open source software. So the Open Source Foundation is the go-in between and protects the developers, the individual people, from lawsuits by the foundation itself becoming the potential target of lawsuits. And then the inverse is also true. To represent the interests of the project, you don't want the individual people to have to act, for example, sue someone for abuse of trademarks. Rather, you want the foundation to go to court if someone uses a project's logo in wrong ways, does not comply with the trademark rules, and so forth. In addition, those who use the open source software realized it's commercially important to them because maybe it's important components in their products. Those who use the software wanted to ensure, or depend on the software, wanted to ensure that this dependency is properly managed, and that in particular nobody could start owning the software and turn the software in a direction not suitable for those who depend on it. Remember the control mechanisms that I talked about last time. If someone were able to gain a stronghold on the software and was able to utilize these control mechanisms, then they could turn the software away from those who are using it and who are not in power. And definitely if your product depends on these open source components, then you don't want that to happen. So you needed clear rules for the intellectual property, the copyright to the code. You want clear rules on who gets to market and how does it get to how is it marketed, this component, who may use the trademarks or the logos and so forth, all the way to influencing or have a way to have a say in how the software will be developed further. And so one example of an open source foundation, I argue it's a community-led foundation as a special purpose, but one of the original open source software foundations is the Apache Software Foundation, who spells out the motivation that I just gave as a main motivation for having such foundation. They said they provide an established framework for the intellectual property, the open source projects. Limit contributors' potential legal exposures because they might get sued over bugs. Provide a place to accept financial contributions to run some infrastructure for the development, and so forth. And the introduction of open source foundations extended the path, the career path, from the original user contributor committer tripod to this sixth step of where you can become a so-called project management committee member, PMC member, after you were already a committer, and then you might become a PMC leader and eventually even a foundation member. So these additional roles are quite important, and they emerged because open source projects came together. If you have a single isolated open source project, then you only need user contributor and committer roles. So the PostgreSQL database, it's not isolated, but it's a standalone project, and hence it has the user contributor committer role. Now in the Apache Software Foundation, what happened is that developers the founders realized that they had more than one project under their roof. They actually had multiple, and the existing projects kept spawning more projects, so that arguably what was happening was the creation of a whole platform, a whole infrastructure layer, in the case of the Apache Software Foundation, for the web. So it's the Apache web server, but it's also Hadoop, it's also all that data streaming, Spark and Flink. These are all important projects with many other offspring or resulting projects that all needed coordination across projects. And first of all, the project itself, the individual component, needed better management, and then it needed coordination across multiple components that were supposed to work together. Hadoop has the core Hadoop, has the Hadoop file system, has many other components that need coordination. So then, that's why project management committees were invented. If you were a committer and you were actively looking towards charting the direction of the project, but then you would have to talk to others of related projects, then you could become a member of the project management committee, which would expand your committer job from reviewing other people's code as a committer and accepting it, committing it, to really charting the roadmap and the path of the project, including talking to other components, making sure the roadmaps across component worked out, worked together well, and so forth. And that meant there were multiple people quickly in a project management committee because context of the particular project went in multiple directions. So you probably wanted more than one person to be the coordinator with the other projects. And that then meant that there would have to be a leader of the project management committee, which had total oversight, or at least was a peer leader among peers who really helped steer the industry platform, and so forth. And the Apache Software Foundation introduced the idea of individual people being foundation members, past being project management committee leaders, so past the technical work, to become coaches for the next generation of technical and managerial leaders in Apache software projects. So I show it here as if it's a succession of steps. It doesn't have to be that you do 1, 2, 3, user, contributor, committer, 4, 5, 6, PMC member, PMC leader, and foundation member. You could possibly skip some as an individual person, and by being a trusted contributor, an active member, you could become a foundation member as well. But usually, to understand how a foundation works, you would go through these different steps and stages. You were basically learning on the job of how, in this case, the Apache, in my example right now, the Apache Software Foundation worked. Now then, these positions are quite important, even commercially important, but I will revisit the consequences for developer careers at some other point in time. And then again, it's important to realize how open source foundations solve some of the problems that if there was a bad faith actor or simply someone who wanted to take control of some open source project, how the foundation would resolve these potential issues. Basically, they would prevent that anyone could get a hold of these choke points to exert control. And the way to do it is, well, to be proactive about it. So for example, an open source foundation, not everyone does it like this, but could require a transfer of copyright for any contribution to the foundation. And then it would be possibly a struggle about who manages the foundation, but that would be different from who runs the project. And then the struggle would be set any potential struggle for power would have to be settled by way of bylaws and eventually possibly even courts. So the foundations acquires the copyrights, and that way nobody can quietly gain that exclusion right granted by copyright to the open source projects. And then patent rights. The right choice of a license implies a patent grant, so the Apache Software Foundation. The Apache Software License version 2 includes a patent grant, and that means you will be unencumbered by any potential patent litigation. If there are necessarily grants on patent usage, they could use the FRAND principle, so that is uncommon. Open source strongly rejects in general software patents as an idea. Trademark rights, same thing. The Open Source Foundation collects the trademarks, defines ways of using what's acceptable in terms of using the trademarks for everyone in a non-discriminatory way, and that way nobody can exert control that way as well. And domain names, websites, same thing, all under the roof of a foundation, ensures that it's the foundation who makes decisions and that there's recourse if someone doesn't agree. Foundations can also cut into project strife. They don't like it, but they do have the power if a social leader, a committer of an open source project is badly misbehaving, they can kick them out. Again, it's highly unlikely this happens, so it needs to be really bad, but that option is there, and arguably knowing that misbehavior might get you fired or removed from committer status already keeps people reasonable and somewhat in line. So I talked about open source foundations in general. I think it's helpful to understand that there are 3 different types, somewhat different motivations, and they tick or work slightly differently. If you're a company, you need to understand these differences in motivation and behavior if you depend on the output, meaning the open source components developed in projects of these foundations. So the first one are the community-led open source foundations. These are foundations where natural people are in the lead. In some cases, these foundations, or often these foundations, accept only natural people, so not legal persons, not legal people, not companies. They don't accept those as members, only natural people. And again, the main example for me is the Apache Software Foundation. It's only the ASF. The ASF only accepts normal, natural people as leaders, as members of the foundation, and keeps companies at least formally out. Of course, people are employed by companies and that might lead to conflicts of interest, but formally companies have no say in the ASF. This is quite different in vendor-led foundations. A vendor-led foundation is an open source foundation, or in my definition, which is predominantly led by software vendors. So obviously then, software vendors, the legal entity, the company, can become a member and has ways as an explicit member of influencing the direction of the foundation and the projects under its roof. So the most well-known example is probably the Linux Foundation, OpenStack Foundation, many others, where there is clearly software vendors, companies leading the charge. This doesn't mean it's a bad foundation or anything. For example, the Eclipse Foundation accepts, next to natural people, also legal people, meaning companies again. And the Eclipse Foundation even used to be, not any longer, but used to be a 501c6, meaning consortium for member benefit organization, but it really acted like the Apache Software Foundation, it was acting solely in the interest of the open source projects, even though companies which are naturally interested in their own profit are and were and are a member. Well, they do bring in membership fees, and that's of course important for the operations of these vendor-led foundations. Vendor-led foundations came into being because there's a third group of motivating factors or reasons to have a foundation. And we already discussed the first two, support and protect people and create a fair equal playing field. But open source foundations, in particular the large open source foundations, were also created to ensure or create a stronger, more competitive ecosystem against established monopolists or established strong players. So the Linux Foundation was created to build up Linux as a competition to Microsoft Windows, for short. So how and why? Well, using open source, vendors who built on open source could get more money from customers. They could price more flexibly and reach more price-sensitive customers, and of course grow the ecosystem and thereby grow the addressable market. I'm picking one here, the how to increase your share of a customer wallet example. Customer wallet is the budget. That means the budget that some company can spend on IT. So you're a bank, you have so and so much money to spend on your IT solutions. And some of that money goes to this company and some of that goes to another company and so forth. If you're a vendor, you want to get as large a percentage of that bank's budget for IT as you can. And open source is important here. On the left, you see, this is an illustration. Reality is always more complex, but the idea is clear here. On the left, you see two competing vendors, one which sells the product at the top and one which sells the platform, for example, or some component the product depends on. So two vendors, and maybe they are equally strong, so both get the same percentage, 50-50, of the customer's wallet. Now, if the vendor behind the product on top was only able to replace the closed source component at the bottom with a cheaper alternative, for example, an open source alternative, then the power of that closed source component vendor would wane or would get diminished because there's now an alternative and hopefully a viable open source alternative. And then the cost of that would go down, and then the pricing flexibility or who acquires what of the customer's wallet would go up for the vendor on top. I illustrate this here by a shift from the left to without open source to a shift to the right with open source. And in the right situation, the vendor of the product in the middle now sold to a customer their solution, their product, on top of an open source component. And then, because that open source component is cheaper, there's suddenly money left in the customer's wallet that maybe the vendor of the product could acquire by upselling the customer, selling new models, cross-selling, whatever. It just has more power to price more highly, or it can simply sell more. In order to go from the left to the right, the product vendor has to help diminish the power of the closed source component vendor, and that means they have to invest in open source. So think about the product as SAP on the left and the closed source component provider is Microsoft's Windows. Then SAP's Business Suite and Microsoft Windows would have to be sold and bought by a customer. But if SAP could only run properly on Linux and Windows was not needed by customers, then SAP could sell its business suite running on top of Linux to customers, and that would give them more pricing flexibility and ultimately a higher share of the customer's wallet, a bigger part of their budget, and thereby higher revenues. And that is why software vendors whose margin gets squeezed by dominant monopolists in the technology stack and the solution stack that customers buy. That's why today these vendors who realize they are increasingly at the mercy of some budding monopolist gang up on that monopolist, gang up on the 800-pound gorilla by forming open source foundations that develop a viable open source alternative to the monopolist's contribution to the product solution stack. That's why Microsoft Windows led to the creation of the Linux Foundation. Intel on the hardware level was getting squeezed by Microsoft, and SAP and Oracle were getting squeezed by Windows and so forth. So they needed to be able to have an alternative to Windows to keep Microsoft in check, and so they invested into Linux as an operating system. Later, same thing happened with Visual Studio, threatening to dominate development, and hence IBM started the Eclipse Foundation to keep the Java ecosystem strong and to avoid that all developers got locked into Microsoft's development software, meaning Microsoft's Visual Studio. And today it's Amazon Web Services that has everyone frightened, and hence, at least a while ago, OpenStack was positioned against AWS. It's maybe more the Cloud Native Foundation, computing foundation these days, but OpenStack clearly was trying to use this pattern of keeping monopolists or near monopolists in check and was applying it to AWS. With Amazon Web Services, of course, it's more complicated because it's not just the software any longer, it's also the capital investment into the hardware. But hardware can be bought. It's really just a capital investment, a mostly understood one, and the software is still the challenge to operate those large data centers around the world. Vendor-led foundations have some dysfunctions. Of course, creative people who always figure out also the downsides or challenges until they get repaired. And if, for example, a foundation is not cautious enough about who runs these projects and does not ensure, like the ASF does, for example, that there is committer diversity, then the existing committers in a project can keep the competition out and can abuse the foundation as a marketing channel for their project and have complementary products to that project and so forth. As I said, the executive director or the board or whoever is in charge at a foundation could possibly step in, but they really don't like doing that. Interfering in how a project conducts its actions is really rare and is really the last resort, because you don't want to do that. You want the project to figure out its own solutions to its problems. So it must get really bad for a board to step in. So we have open source foundations in general, and then we had community-led and then vendor-led foundations. I would like to talk about a huge opportunity and an interesting phenomenon that has been more slowly than vendor-led foundations been developing, but that's also already 15 years old. And that phenomenon are the user-led open source foundations. So a user-led open source foundation is a foundation which has as the driving members, which is predominantly led by the users of softwares, hence not the IT industry in general, unless they are in the user role, but rather all the other industries who need software. And if you think that's not so common, think again. This is really up and coming, and that's why it's also an important research topic for us in this year 2020 still. Here are a couple of examples, and you can see how, so for example, Apereo Foundation, that's educational software for universities. Open Library, that's for libraries. Neither universities nor libraries are IT industry players, they're just users of software. The financial services industry uses this. The ASWF is an interesting one. That's a foundation to ensure independence of some dominant software for movie rendering. So RenderMan is a closed source software, and I believe the ASWF is about having an alternative to that. So it's the movie industry, the Hollywood studios, who realized their dependencies on closed source software and how they didn't want that, and are putting open source software against it. Open Consequence is a favorite example of mine. These are the German energy providers, the Stadtwerke, who manage the last kilometer of electricity and other utilities to your house. And they needed software for the smart grid. They are not software companies. They need a lot of software, so they joined forces under my guidance to create this smart grid software for their own needs. And users do that, software users, not the individual people, but companies then usually do that because they got fed up with vendor lock-in. So if you're a software vendor, you like lock-in of your users into your product. If you're a user, you do not like lock-in into a vendor's products. What are the problems with vendor lock-in? Well, the vendor is a for-profit entity. They will try to keep raising prices as much as they can. And the harder the lock-in, meaning the higher the switching costs to an alternative, all the way to there is no alternative, means the vendor can keep rising prices. But it's not just the costs to the user. If a vendor is dominant and has little to fear from competition, the vendor gets lazy. The users may need extra features. They may need new features. They may ask for these features, but why does the vendor care if the users are locked in and are paying anyway? Maybe they want to be a good vendor, but maybe not. New development, innovation costs money, and if people keep paying anyway, why react speedily to any feature requests? Not to mention that different user companies have possibly competing needs, and then the users have to get in line, and maybe that line is long until something happens. And obviously open source is a great alternative because A, the cost is low, and B, if you need work done, you can do it yourself, or you can hire someone to do it for you. Finally, sometimes the life cycles of products or even companies are completely out of sync. The software industry is pretty fast moving. A company which has been around for 10 years is already an old company. Not so, say, in the automotive or the aeronautics space. So if you're an automotive company or you're a manufacturer of trains and locomotives, you look at lifetimes of your products to 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Planes or locomotives can live that long. Software vendors whose software operates your products may have long gone out of business or have been bought, and their products may have been discontinued. That's a serious operational risk for many software users, and hence they prefer open source software, which will not go out of business because it will always be around and you can help yourself. So then software users realize maybe they need to take their software fate into their own hands, and that's why they decided to create user-led foundations where the users are in the say. And the purpose of a user-led open source foundation is to put the users in command so that they can create and structure their supplier ecosystem. Meaning they define the rules how products and services, how our products are built on community open source, and how services are rendered on top of that. Hence, a user-led foundation will manage and sponsor and manage the development of some community open source platform, and then will let product vendors and service firms build on top of that. And they will always want to make sure that all products built on top create much less lock-in than a classic traditional closed source product, so that there's always the threat by a user that they can more easily switch to another vendor or another service provider, because a large part of the product is really what's in the community open source software, and hence they have to invest in the community open source software, and they get that threat to switch and the benefit of lower switching costs that keeps vendors in line. And that's the way how the users create their own supplier ecosystem. That's at least the idea. Interestingly enough, it turned out to be a business opportunity, arguably, for existing open source foundations. So the Linux Foundation and the Eclipse Foundation, sadly not the Apache Software Foundation, but the Eclipse Foundation, for example, realized this opportunity and established the concept of industry working groups, where an industry working group really is a user-led open source foundation. So the Eclipse Foundation may be the home for these projects, but it gives these projects so much flexibility and governance definition that the resulting projects, for example, ASCII-Doc or OpenPass or OpenMDM or Open Mobility, examples on the right here, act like they were individual user-led foundations. And this way Eclipse grows its memberships, can compete more effectively with the Linux Foundation and so forth. The question from a business perspective that nobody has been able to answer yet is how to take advantage of that. The membership fees that the Eclipse Foundation gathers are not the business opportunity. The business opportunity is running these user-led foundations and benefiting from the products and services that they offer to the users who are trying to keep the vendors in those and their products based on those community open source platforms in check. But again, nobody has cracked that yet, but it is clearly a huge opportunity, because this is now increasingly, as they smarten and wisen up, what everyone who is not the software industry will do. My examples were, say, the automotive industry. So they are pretty technical, so they can warm up to open source. But then suddenly there were the Hollywood studios. Are they technical? Well, maybe, and they got smarter. And so word will travel, and everyone who is a software user and who dislikes how they are at the mercy of software vendors, closed source software vendors, may want to start or join such a user-led foundation, and hence I would expect a major shift in the industry and possibly, arguably, a threat to the good life of software vendors and their profits. Anyway, we will see how this goes together with commercial open source in future lectures. So finally, open source projects have a life cycle. It's similar to products, I would argue. They are born, they grow, they mature, decline, they might die. They always live longer than expected because they're always users. And well, COBOL, for example, as one of the original programming languages from the 60s, is still very much alive and kicking. but there might be death eventually, and we just don't know when. So that's why open source projects are more like products rather than projects. What's also interesting is how they come into being. So I would argue that as soon as companies now realize, in particular vendors in the software industry, that in the solution stack for customers, one layer is getting so dominant that they might become a monopolist and gobble up all the budget of customers, that then the other layers in the stack will join forces to keep that possible monopolist in check, as explained, and that leads to community open source projects, individual projects, even distributions, and that this is driving a commoditization of more and more and more open source, and that this is kind of driving innovation further on. It's like a big bang where the opportunity to make money by way of traditional closed source or even commercial open source is being driven away from the source of the universe by community projects on their heels. So they need to keep innovating, and they need to capture new ground rather than trying to occupy established ground, which will be firmly held over time by community open source projects. So that's it from me today. We realized that there's a second way of looking at open source and the innovation of open source, which is not just the artifact, the source code, but rather that it's a way of collaboration, leading to projects of people collaborating. And then we looked at the organizational structures behind projects and project communities, the original self-defined ones, but then increasingly with growing commercial relevance, the open source foundations. And then we looked at the different types of open source foundations and how they satisfy the needs of their founders and stakeholders, and closed with a look on project lifecycle. That's it from me today. Next time we will start with how all of this can be turned around to have a commercial business based on open source. So we will utilize a lot of the knowledge we gained about intellectual property and control mechanisms while still trying to be a proper open source project. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and see you next time.